Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The big battle of the superpowers is supposed to be coming across our way in the next year, 2, 3, 5 decade, who knows? And that's not the war in Ukraine. The war is between US and China. There are multiple facets to this conflict, this conflagration, this issue between both the countries. And of course, one of the biggest factors that is coming out into the world is our very country, India. What is the battle between USA and China, and how does India play a role, or India fit into this gambit of these two giant countries trying to settle scores with each other? To discuss this, I have with me Major General Vivek Sehgal for the first time on Dev Talks. Sir, hello and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking out the time to talk to me.
Thank you very much, Adi. It's a pleasure to be here with you on the show, and I sincerely hope that I shall be able to do justice to the topic that you have very aptly said is a very, very contemporary and interesting topic, which is keeping everybody engaged in the world today.
Indeed, sir. So the battle lines have been formed. One thing that everybody knows each other's red lines. The US knows their red lines, the Chinese know the other side's red lines. Both sides kind of breach it sometimes, kind of finger into it sometimes. Uh, Things are a little weird at the moment, but I just want to ask you to open this discussion. So, what is the overall paradigm? What encompasses the paradigm of a battle line or the battle between USA and China?
Adi, as per my thinking, what is very important to understand is in today's world, in the contemporary world today, US continues to remain the sole superpower, and China is a rising power. What also needs to be understood is that China is a realist power, and very well, it is very proud of its past history. And one of the things that it has learned or taken from its past history is that the world is anarchic and there is a hierarchical order of things in this world. And therefore, as China rises, it is going to compete with a power which is already there on the pedestal and try and share influence and global affairs with it or even surpass it. Now, this is aptly proved when China talks about the China dream, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. What exactly is this? It implies, firstly, continued economic well being of the people, continued, survival or preservation of the existing political order. Unification and sovereignty, of course, remain supreme, and regional supremacy and global influence. These are the few things that it is looking at to be able to rejuvenate to its glorious past. Now, in essence, being a realist power, it believes that a hierarchical relationship is what will sustain it, and it looks at a unipolar Asia in which China reigns supreme, and a bipolar, or if not bipolar, then a multipolar world in which China can hold its own in sync with the other important powers that are existing. So, therefore, you'll find that as China rises, there are going to be areas of conflict that it will have with the existing superpower. And these get further aggravated, especially in our context in the Indo Pacific, because now the center of gravity, the economic center of gravity, is shifting towards the Indo Pacific. What I would like to state here is that Indo Pacific today contains countries which are rising economically. The financial capability of the citizens of this area is growing. The population in this area is vast. Therefore, all countries will vie for markets and potential trade in this area, and hence it becomes important. But what also needs to be kept in mind, while people have been talking about the era of geoeconomics coming into play, unfortunately, geopolitics has not taken a backseat. Geopolitics continues to hold sway. So, I think it is a this jostling for a geopolitical upper hand between the two will continue to make them adversaries and have confrontational issues coming up more and more. How they balance this in the times ahead is something that we all have to wait and see.
Interesting. So the battle lines are, of course, more of a rhetoric, more of narratives, and of course sanctions, which is very interesting. And the trade and cooperation still continues at the public and the private level, at the private enterprise level, at the levels of large industries and stuff like that. Now that is very interesting to me that the industrialists from USA are still investing in China. There's a lot of Western capital still going into China. How does this come into the whole game, sir? Because at the end of it, you're trying to make somebody else fight your battle. I will invest in China. I will get whatever benefit I want, but you please make sure that you stand up with China. Is that the narrative that one sees? Because a lot of people actually talk about the fact that it's and a lot of people from the Chinese side, and we also believe so that we should not go too overboard with the US because it will antagonize a line of actual control situation that we probably don't need, or it is not, in our interest. How do you kind of look at this particular paradigm and balance what India goes through?
Yeah, very rightly brought out. I mean, uh, the countries are very, very, in this globalized era and over a period of the last 3 decades, the integration that has taken place in the on the economic front is tremendous.
Hmm.
China has, in fact, reached where it has reached because of the investments by the West into China. The uh, companies in the West taking advantage of the cheap labor that was existing in China, facilitated by the reforms that the Chinese government put in place at that point in time to be able to set their manufacturing bases in China and be able to take advantage of the lower cost of manufacturing. So, as a result, a bulk of the supply chains that are of important issue areas do start in China or do have a major segment in China. And it is very difficult for any country today to totally delink itself from the Chinese economy and yet be able to survive. But as I mentioned earlier, while geoeconomics is important, geopolitics has not taken a back seat. And therefore, confrontational issues are likely to continue to come up and will need to be ironed out between the countries as they come. See, as of now, this relationship, that trade relationship that the two countries have, of course, it precludes a feasibility of a hot war taking place between the two. But there are going to be pushbacks on contentious issues from both sides.
Hmm.
The endeavor of both sides is or will be to try and stymie the coercive ability of each side. Now, whenever there is I mean, what I want to say is, uh, any country, if it wants to influence anybody else, it has certain actions that it has to do. It has to be able to coerce that other country to fall in line. It should be able to induce through appeasement a country to follow the agenda that the country sets, or, and last but not the least, it must have legitimacy. So these are the three criterias through which you can recognize a great power that is wielding influence. America is already there, the United States is already there, China is looking at coming up to this level. So there is a battle that is on between the two to ensure that all these three actions, coercion, inducement, and legitimacy of each other, is targeted to ensure that it does not reach the levels of influence that probably it desires to reach. And if you look at the Chinese actions. The Chinese have consistently tried to project to the, especially the South Asian region, that you may have relations with America, you may have relations with the United States, but the United States is not a partner on whom you can rely. The actions taken by the Chinese in the South China Sea, incremental creation of islands in the region, have all shown that the Americans have not responded adequately. And probably what they're trying to project is that in case push comes to shove, the American interests will reign supreme and the countries in the region will be left to fight for themselves. And therefore, it is better that you fall in line with the rising power in the region. So, this is
Very,
how
very.
I,
Sorry,
yeah,
please. No, you brought something very interesting out with regards to the credibility of America, and that's something to me is a very realistic proposition, because when you look at a lot of people and a lot of writing in India, a lot of people are being cautious with regards how India should deal with the US vis-a-vis China. Jumping into an alliance with the US is actually, a lot of people one should understand it should be beneficial to us, but it is understood that it's not going to be beneficial to us. There'll be a lot of issues that we will face. So you brought this out very, very interestingly. So the battle lines, as per se, the belief is that it forms around Taiwan. The battle
yeah,
lines between USA and China are Taiwan.
hmm,
There is also Japan, where the US is involved physically. There's also South Korea, where the chances of something breaking out are pretty low. But it's the Japanese and the Taiwanese line which has been drawn by the US, I guess, to tell China, yeah, this is a no-go zone. You
yeah,
do anything, there is going to be a response. Of course, with Japan is an overt expression of a response. With Taiwan, it's not. So, are these the battle lines that will form into a potential military war or potential military confrontation between the two countries, or is there any other region that is also in focus of these two nations, sir?
yeah. I'll just like you to take a step back. You see, what I was bringing out was that these three areas, that is the ability to coerce, the ability to induce, and the legitimacy, are the three things that rising power would target in existing power to ensure that it can take away the influence that it has in that region.
Hmm.
What is also important is that uh, as China is rising, the Americans have now realized, or the US has now realized, that there is a need to take action to ensure that the Chinese influence does not surpass them in times to come. And accordingly, they have started taking certain actions. They've, like you said yourself, Japan has increased its defense budget for the first time. Uh, US has started shoring up its alliances with the regional countries. Vietnam, for the first time, has seen arms export from the United States to Vietnam. The Quad, the AUKUS have been put in place. So there are actions that the Americans are taking to as a countervailing force to this
Hmm.
Chinese growing power. So this is an important thing that we need to keep in mind. And as rightly brought out by you, uh, because the two countries are less likely to come into a one-on-one confrontation, as it does not suit them and as their economies are very well integrated, and a one-on-one confrontation is going to be very, very damaging to both the economies. Proxies is what comes into play to try and ensure supremacy or dominance. Taiwan, rightly, is one such area which, while the US recognizes the one China policy, it is not ready to accept Chinese domination over Taiwan, because Taiwan remains a democracy, and unless Taiwan itself cedes to China, the US is not going to accept it. And the US providing the kind of defense material to the Taiwanese and shoring them up is liable to ensure that the Taiwanese continue to remain independent and hence a bone of contention between the two nations. And if you see as to how the Chinese have grown, they have, uh, you know, they have grown their military, their armed forces in a manner which is targeting the ability of the US to come into the contested zones or contested maritime zones, I would say, in time and space and be effective against the Chinese. They were weak, their navy is growing, they have a missile force which is very potent, and their peninsular nature into the South China Sea gives them the reach with their missile force to be able to target even beyond Taiwan and keep the US forces at bay if feasible. They have technologically, with the cyber and the space capabilities that they are developing, also been able to muster a capability to target the major US vulnerability or major technologically advanced country vulnerability of dependence for communication, surveillance, intelligence on space per se. So, this is how it is going forward. And one has to wait and watch as to how it is going to play out.
I must say that answer is quite revealing. It comes bang in the middle of our segment, so it's a very revealing answer. You've actually brought about an interesting thing that they have militarized themselves to keep the USA at bay. And when one thinks of it, most of the ships of this great navy that the Chinese have built up are Coast Guard ships. So it's obviously a certain message and it's obviously a certain design that they're trying to follow. But so I wanted to also ask you that with the US being occupied, just as a follow up to this question, the US being occupied in Ukraine and pretty much emptying up their coffers, as to say, and this is not a conjecture. This is something which is coming out in the Washington Post and New York Times, and a lot of their own people are talking about this. How does the US try and keep this situation just short of war? Because at the moment, I wonder if they would want to afford a war in the South China Sea region, sir.
You're right. I mean, today the entire world is looking at the Russian-Ukraine conflict and the U.S. involvement in that. Uh, I think the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has on one hand played in favor of the United States, in that the NATO, which was becoming a little irrelevant in the past, has suddenly become a strong entity once again. At the same time, there is a flip side to it, and that is that with the involvement of the US and the West in Europe, it creates a geopolitical space that is available for maneuvering within in the rest of the world. So, I think the US is today trying to balance between the two. It cannot shy away from the commitment that it has taken up in Europe, and at the same time, it does not want to give a free hand in the rest of the area. And therefore, like I mentioned earlier, energizing the Quad, the AUKUS shift or the pivot towards Asia, as spoken about by Obama and Clinton and Trump. Now, these are all actions to ensure that the space for maneuver that is available outside Europe is not readily available for this country. I just like to mention one thing here. You know, my way of thinking is that the West has always been balance of power centric. And when I say balance of power centric, balance of power means hard power. It means military power. It means economic power. It means resources. So the West has always been balance of power centric and has looked at keeping a check on any other nation or a bloc by ensuring that they retain primacy in the hard power. The Chinese, on the other hand, have looked at it from, I call it, the balance of influence perspective. Now, there's a subtle difference. I agree that if you have power, you automatically have influence. But
Mhm.
when you're playing balance of power, I feel the relationship is zero sum. You're either a part of that balancing equation, or you are not. Yeah, and but if you are playing balance of influence, then there is a subtle difference. You have a space for maneuver as a weaker country as to whether you want to pursue or follow the line of the influencer or want to remain neutral. Now, to amplify this point, what I want to say is that most of the countries in Southeast Asia, in the Oceania, in Africa, in Middle East, these are all developing countries. And these countries require investment, they require infrastructure development, they require hard cash to be able to bring their population out of poverty, so to say. And this ready availability of cash from the Chinese is something that they are not likely to ignore or not likely to set away. They would be more than willing to accept what the Chinese are ready to give them, as is evident from, let us say, the success of the BRI project that the Chinese have launched. So it is only now that the US and the rest of the countries has realized that we have to put our purse where it matters. And today you have Japan, India looking at infrastructure development in Southeast Asia, looking at infrastructure projects in Africa, looking at infrastructure projects in the Middle East, the US ready to give financial aid to countries in the region to ensure that China does not have advantage in terms of being able to make client states out of these small states within the region. So this is something I feel that this mismatch that was existing and is only being corrected today is very important to understand. China has been looking at creating a constituency of smaller states, which in multilateral forums can help the Chinese push their agenda. Now, whether it is the UN, whether it is other multilateral fora, it is looking at a grouping of states which are like-minded, which are uh, subservient to it, who will be able to assist in getting weight behind what the Chinese want to achieve. So this is how I see it. And as far as Russia and Ukraine is concerned, I mean, you know, what we said about the flip side, the advantage and disadvantage to the United States is one side. But look at China. The Chinese have actually got the Russians now uh, very, very closely into their camp. That's one major advantage that they've accrued. The second advantage is, of course, because of the sanctions and inability of the Russians to be able to trade with the rest of the world, the discounted prices that the Russians have been able to offer have been cashed upon by the Chinese. And in effect, their trade with Russia has grown by as much as 25% in this period. In addition to that, uh, you know, the actions by the West and also actions by Russia in Ukraine are a model that probably the Chinese are studying very, very hard to template on a Taiwan situation should it arise. So there are certain major advantages that the Chinese have earned from this, and then look at their ability to project themselves as a global power which can negotiate peace. They've done it in Saudi Arabia and Iran. They've offered Israel and Palestine. They've offered Ukraine that okay, we will mediate, but let's come to a table and let's amicably arrive at a peaceful solution to the existing problem. So, China willy nilly has been able to shore up its diplomatic potential and project to the world that it is a responsible stakeholder and would like to wield the influence that comes automatically to it because of its trade relationships and economic might in the rest of the world.
Interesting. So, the next thing that I'd like to ask you is about India. The rise of India today, of course, is going to be a big, I mean, logically speaking, would be a big challenge to China. And combined with that, the Indian involvement in the strategic values or the strategic outlook of the US, and kind of finding a middle ground where both the countries could work together on common interests. Of course, we don't have the same interests all over the place, but there has been a balance that has been created between both the relationships, both the countries, where they've realized, okay, this is certain areas we can cooperate in. How does China see the rise of India and its cooperation with the US and the West to allegedly push back or allegedly contain China as the narrative goes, sir?
You know, again, it's a very, very interesting question. I mean, China is very well aware that because of the border dispute that it has with India, uh, the relationship with India will always be under the umbrella of that border dispute, which is a zero-sum game. And the Chinese have, as you are aware, tried to project that let us put the border aside. Let's
Mm.
try and leave it for posterity to decide, and either one way or the other, and let us go ahead with our engagement and grow together in a very, very responsive manner. Uh, it is only recently, with the Indian growth as it is coming about, that the Chinese have suddenly started taking interest in what India is all about. I feel that both India and China are growing in the same strategic space. Now, the hierarchical model or thought process that the Chinese have, the Middle Kingdom mindset that the Chinese have, does not allow a peer competitor in the same strategic space. So, therefore, they are going to contest the rise of India one way or the other as time goes by. That is a given. There was a period in the past when China was not where it is today, when it required India to be able to project a common front on certain contentious issues in the international arena. Now, that's the time when engagement with India was very important. So, it did strategically engage India while issues at the border continued, but those were managed through the confidence building measures and other provisions that were put in place at that point in time. I feel that the situation has changed today, especially with the 2020 clash that we've seen in Galwan and the consequent passing of forces along the eastern Ladakh border. Uh, there is a change in the situation, and that is primarily because China realizes that India was moving towards the United States. It needs to keep it away. India is rising in the same strategic space. It needs to ensure that India does not rise without hurdles. And more importantly, the Indian strategic position in the Indian Ocean gives it a great maritime advantage if push comes to shove. And therefore, by actions on the border and keeping India land centric, it can to some extent ensure that the maritime domain continues to remain neglected in times to come. So these are certain areas that the Chinese have been working on, I feel. Another issue that has been irking them is the issue of BRI. Now, I just like to amplify this word, this issue of BRI. My way of looking at it is, you know, if you go historically, Mackinder once said that the Eurasian landmass is the heartland, and whoever controls the heartland is going to control the world.
Yes, sir.
Similarly, another theorist, Spikeman, said that no, whoever controls the rimland will automatically control the heartland, and therefore, whoever controls the rimland is likely to control the world. If you look at I feel that consequent to the fall of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union, smaller states coming up in the Central Asian Republic, the Chinese have been able to make inroads into these areas, thereby along the land border extending its reach into the Eurasian landmass and also down south towards the Middle East and Africa. So the land bridge is extension of reach into the Eurasian landmass, and the maritime side, if you look, the vast coastline that the Chinese have gives them access to the world. But this access passes through choke points. This access passes through an area which is dominated by the United States. This access is timed in by the first and second island chains, so to say, and the distances involved are tremendous. So the maritime Silk Road, as they call it, is all about securitizing this access. So what it willy-nilly is doing, control the heartland by getting into the heartland along the land, control the rimland by the actions or interactions with the countries along the rimland, be it Myanmar, be it Thailand, be it Malaysia, Singapore, say Sri Lanka, Pakistan, etc. And of course, making inroads into the Middle East, a bastion of the United States. With the United States involvement was probably the Europe, they found space to exploit within the Middle East and have done it very well. So they are following both the Mackinder and Spikeman to be able to ensure that they have a juggernaut hold over the Eurasian landmass per se. And if that happens, and if they are able to create this kind of an infrastructure of communications, both land and digital, then automatically the Chinese will become the center of flow of trade from east to the west or north to the south.
Putting out a very, very scary circumstance, if I may say that. Allow me to just.
I don't know. I mean, this is how I felt, and
yeah, of course,
it's one
they've tried quite a bit. How far it will be successful is something, of course,
successful is something different.
we could talk about in our next discussion, sir. So my last question to you would be in a situation of a war, actually a hot war firing open between USA and China. The war will be obviously in the east. Uh, the Chinese, to my mind, are a bit nervous about that because they realize that no matter a lot of effort that they put to create a two-front situation with India, today they face the same in their own backyards, both in the east and the west. How do you think the Chinese plan to kind of take this forward? And if you could just tell us the perspective from China, the perspective from US, and of course our own perspective, how do we look at a war in the South China Sea?
Like I mentioned earlier, uh, and a hot war between the two countries, between US and China, is not really an option for either of the two. They would like to, as far as possible, manage their affairs without getting into a hot war. At the same time, you cannot deny, you know, a sort of a proxy war scenario that used to exist in the erstwhile Cold War. Now, again, what we are looking at in Taiwan probably is something similar, with the US not getting actively engaged into fighting the war for Taiwan, but providing all support in terms of weapons, equipment, intelligence, etc., etc. So that is how I see it. I mean, I don't think that it is in the interest of either of the two countries to get into a hot war. Both the countries realize that, and they will do their level best to remain away from it. But at the same time, with the way the capabilities are developing, with the way they are, uh, jostling for power in that constricted space of the so-called, connection between, I would say, India and Indo and Pacific Oceans, Indian and Pacific Oceans. Uh, the very proximity can result in things going out of hand if it comes that way. So one has to be very careful on that. As far as war between these two nations is concerned, or let's say the Taiwan conflict is concerned, US has done, or US has got the like-minded nations around to be able to create a strategic or a conventional deterrence,
Mm.
or try to project a conventional deterrence in front of China. Whether China accedes to that or does not accede to that, it still goes in for a conflict with Taiwan is something that only time can tell. Uh, However, once a conflict of this nature does come about, I think while you are right that open borders with India are liable to present a two-front scenario to the Chinese, and the United States, who to some extent want to exploit that. We have to see as to whether we will really get actively involved in supporting or I would say, substantiating that two-front threat. I don't think that will happen. I mean, after all, ultimately, India has to look at its own national interests, and getting into a conflict at that stage, uh, beyond probably ensuring that you are strong along the border, which we already are, and therefore inhibiting any weakness that the Chinese may perforce have to create by moving forces out of this area is something that psychologically can be affecting the Chinese. But I don't think we will open a front with them, and I don't think the United States would also really look at forcing India to open a second front. I think the war in that case will be localized, probably in the South China Sea. It will be between the two countries, and it will continue something akin to probably what we are seeing in Ukraine and Russia for some time. And in the ultimate analysis, probably it will peter off, and only time can tell as to who will be the winner. That's how I see it. I mean, I don't think it is going to be a confrontation that will really get in other nations to take sides. They'll do their bit, but
Mm.
taking sides and getting actively involved in war may not be the case in fact.
It's a dangerous scenario right in our neighborhood. So as it is, we've got one country that refuses to give up in terms of its own effort to break itself down, but know, we've got another one which is actually picking up fights from all over the place. Sir, this has been wonderful. The first interaction on Dev Talks is been quite an eye opener, as a matter of fact, with regards to global affairs and the US and China, for the lack of a better word, game that they're playing between themselves of global domination, regional domination. The narrative keeps changing because the Chinese and the US have different viewpoints with regards the situation. But India is placed in a very interesting area, location, and between both these adversaries, as you very rightly brought out. And of course, our interests have to be paramount. So, as I said, thanks so much for doing the research and actually bringing out some very interesting and important points. And of course, we would like to, as I said previous to this question, that the Chinese efforts towards domination and Chinese efforts towards ensuring that their hegemony is kind of getting formed, whether that is successful or not, is something that we could discuss probably in our next show. Till then, sir, thank you so much once again, and Jai Hind.
Thanks a lot, Adi. I hope I've been able to make some meaningful contributions. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and we'll look forward to second session sometimes in the future. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.